Welcome to Bharati 100, a podcast dedicated to exploring the life and legacy of Indian national poet C. Subramania Bharati, 100 years after his death. This is Meera T. Sundararajan, the poet's great-granddaughter. On November 11th, the world commemorates one of history's most moving and painful anniversaries, the conclusion of World War I. The armistice agreement was signed on November 11th, 1918, a Monday, at 11 o'clock in the morning. The following year, Armistice Day was observed across the British Commonwealth. Countries around the world commemorate this day under different names and with different symbols. In Canada, it's Remembrance Day, and the red poppy is the symbol of the conflict brought to an end. In the United States, it's known as Veterans Day and encompasses the commemoration of other wars where American soldiers fought and died. Those events unfolded now more than 100 years ago. Those who lived through them are gone. At the time, the perspective on the war was very different from our perspective today. We see it as the event that inaugurated what might be called the cruelest century, the 20th century, a century of wars, of conflicts that extended human imagination for that most banal of attributes, to paraphrase Hannah Arendt, evil. In those first days, as the war unfolded, Bharati's initial reaction was one of pure horror. He writes, "From whatever philosophical height one may choose to survey the momentous struggle now going on in Europe, one cannot help taking sides unless one ceases to be human. The thing is so grand, so terrible, so tragic, so human. It is a pity that men should have to die like this." For those who were alive in 1914, when the war started, they sensed the onset of something unlike anything that they had ever seen before. Bharati, as a journalist, was even more caught up in these events than most, and his writing on the war reminds us that there were many perspectives on the conflict, depending on where in the world you were based when it erupted, and where your countrymen found themselves in relation to the great powers involved. Today, at a century's remove, there is sometimes a tendency to focus on the European origins of the war and to imagine that those who suffered and sacrificed were primarily Europeans. In fact, nothing could be further from the truth. In many ways, the war had its origins in squabbles about colonialism amongst the European powers, and when Britain went to fight, soldiers drawn from its colonies all around the world came to support Britain in her hour of need. It is therefore an important reality that Indian soldiers made significant contributions to the war effort, and India suffered heavy losses as a result. But none of this was really a given. In fact, the war arose at a crucial moment in the history of the Indian freedom movement. Just as the Indian National Congress was making headway against the British government, hoping for major concessions, the war came upon Britain, and the British government put aside its discussions of Indian freedom, instead calling upon Indians to support them in the conflict. Indians could have reacted in any number of ways to this situation. But for Bharati, it was very important that India should not in any way press its advantage against the British at this time of difficulty. On the contrary, he doesn't look upon this as a conflict between Britain and other European powers. He sees it in quite a different light, as one further episode, a grand and important episode in the eternal struggle of good against evil. In that struggle, Bharati was absolutely convinced the forces of good must triumph. In considering this great conflict, this great challenge to humanity, Bharati looks at it not only in historical perspective, but in a sense in mythological and spiritual perspective. Perhaps he was thinking at some level about the Mahabharata, India's great epic of a great mythological war, with its endless lessons for humanity's betterment. Perhaps he was thinking more generally about the fragility of human affairs and human life, the powerlessness that sometimes seems to overcome us as individuals and as a race. But his belief in the necessity for the victory of good, in the ultimate triumph of positive human values, was not fatalism in any usual sense, certainly not the fatalism that, as he writes elsewhere, certain people say led to the fall of the East. Instead, Bharati believes that humanity is on a moral trajectory, and he links that journey to his understanding of the divine will, which, as we know from our reading of Bharati, was not by any means a religious idea tied to any particular dogma. Instead, it was a broad vision of human nature and the conviction that at the heart of human character lies a divine spark, perhaps inexplicable, but nevertheless real. His musings about the nature of war and of history remind me of Tolstoy's discussion at the end of War and Peace, where he wonders about the forces that move human beings and human history, and in fact speculates about the very nature of history itself. Is it the story of great heroes, of great cultures, of politics, of civilizations? There is a mystery at the heart of history. As Bharati writes, we in India have always thought and still think that the destinies of all things here on earth are controlled by superior forces of whose nature man has yet known but little. The affairs of cawing crows and of civilized nations, of cats and of supermen, are all determined by divine laws, the laws of those whom we call the immortals. The diplomats and statesmen of the world think that they themselves decide the fates of nations. We think that the diplomats and statesmen are wrong. And his conclusion here is crucial, for Bharati does not approve of seizing this moment to denigrate the British or the Europeans. Instead, he says, we must approach the situation with humility and diffidence. All beings are instruments of the divine will, he writes, and act for ends which they can never fully comprehend. We know this, and we are therefore possessed with a sense of humility and diffidence when we want to understand the real objects for which the gods have sent this grim and terrible tragedy into the fair and prosperous land of Europe. In fact, Bharati does something quite unexpected here. Writing under the rubric, Why We Love Europe, he reviews the achievements of European civilization and comments, whatever mental or moral victories Europe may have won for herself, she has also won for the whole of humanity. He writes, mankind is fundamentally one. True seers have everywhere proclaimed the unity of the human race. Ultimately, he believes that the war and the terrible price and suffering that it is extracting from human beings everywhere has come for an important reason, for the learning of human beings and ultimately for their benefit. All of that learning is governed, in his view, by divine laws, by moral laws. Those laws, he writes, are inexorable. Certain ideas have got to triumph. Certain principles have got to be realized among men. And man generally learns new lessons at a frightful cost. The new lesson that human beings had to learn through the terrible but inevitable means of the Great War was the lesson of equity. Bharati writes, "In Europe today, the Allies maintain that they fight for international equity, for the rights of nations and individuals, while the Germans say that they are fighting, among other things, for the maintenance and advancement of their culture. They even speak of Germanizing the world. I am willing to admit that, on the side of the Allies also, there are certain people whose love for liberty and equity is of very recent origin. But still, there remains the fact that their war cry is each nation for itself, while the other side lays more stress on imposing German culture on the rest of us." And here again, Bharati comes to another crucial point: the difficulty of trying to decide who is right and who is wrong in a broader sense, in fact, the futility of such an exercise. Looking back at human history, no culture, no nation, no people has always been right. On the contrary, Bharati says, if we look to the past, we can see that at some point or another, every nation, every people has been wrong. We are all guilty in that sense of wrongdoing. We therefore can't turn our attention to what is happening at this particular moment in time by making some sort of global moral assessment of the parties. Instead, we have only one choice, which is to accept our shared guilt and, more to the point, our shared responsibility. Bharati writes, "There is no use in thinking about past incidents. In the past, everyone has been wrong, in Asia as well as in Europe. We must forgive the past. There remains no doubt, however, that in the present war, the right is with the Allies. And we in India, all of us who count for anything, being passionate lovers of the cause of freedom, we pray that the side which will guarantee the freedom of nations, which will demolish once and for all the stupid doctrine that might is right, which will establish a permanent and universal system of international equity and mutual respect, that side should win. This is the reason why India is so willing to sacrifice her men and resources towards aiding England and her allies. Let us do what is right now," he says. In that sense, there is only now. And the only way forward is forgiveness. These are words that are tremendously important for us today. All of this underscores Bharati's support for India's sacrifices in the war, and it's all the more remarkable remembering that he was in the thick of things as he was writing this. The war had just begun. Neither he nor anyone knew what the outcome would be. Looking back from the present, it is easy for us to say that Bharati was on the right side of history, that the discourse that he adopted in writing about the war is one that resonates with us today, and that he was successful in claiming the moral high ground in a way that makes sense to today's readers. But at the time, nothing was given, nothing was known. By finding a moral position for India in relation to the war, he was shining a light into darkness. And it must be said, he expected something from England in return. He expected England to receive moral lessons from its experience in the war and to understand the nature of its relationship, its moral dependence on the countries which it ruled as colonies, including, of course, India, foremost among them. England will never forget India's generosity and magnanimity. She will not disappoint the civilized world by denying her present ideals when the war is over. Since Bharati died in 1921, he did not live to see the horrors that would come in the following decades of 20th century history. He did not know that before India would achieve her freedom from British rule, another great and even more terrible conflict would unfold, testing the human capacity for evil in ways that were unimaginable. It was in this climate that India finally did achieve her freedom in 1947, long after Bharati's time, and the country itself was torn asunder by the kind of conflict that Bharati had spent his life trying to overcome. Today, we keep alive the occasion of Remembrance Day, commemoration of the armistice. But memory fades. It is difficult to look back through the mists of time and try to see, as the people who were then alive saw it, the magnitude of the conflict that they faced, the new understanding of human reality that was born in those terrible battlefields, and the purpose, ultimately, of those sacrifices. Reading Bharati's comments reminds us that the world at large participated in these events, that the sacrifices were not made only by Europeans or people from developed countries like Canada and Australia, but in fact, they were made by people all over the world. Those sacrifices unfolded in a spirit of hope for the betterment of humanity and a world order that would be based on equity and international justice. Bharati expresses it beautifully. When we remember the warriors, many of them unknown, who fought for the future in those times, who fought for us, let us remember that many of them were Indian and came from other diverse parts of the world. India, Bharati explains, has an intense passion for peace, and this is why so many Indians laid down their lives during the Great War. For many people today, those Indian soldiers are the unknown warriors whom we commemorate on November 11th.